Welcome to this online lesson on the civil rights movement in the USA, fighting segregation in education, Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education case of 1954. The little girl who's now been circled is called Linda Brown. She became very famous in the mid-1950s, not necessarily for anything that she did directly, but for what she came to represent. In this photograph, Linda Brown is shown in her all-black elementary school. That's similar to a primary school in the UK. Your task then: why might segregation in schools make black people feel inferior? Now, the word inferior means less good or not equal. Give that some thought. When you're ready to proceed, just press play again and we'll move on. Press pause now. Well, the thing was, there wasn't anything inherently racist going on in that classroom itself, but the very concept of separating pupils out on the basis of race reinforced an idea that was absolutely pervasive in America at this time, that black pupils were supposed to feel inferior to their white counterparts. Separating them on the basis of race only reinforced that. However, it's inaccurate to say that the school facilities in Topeka, Kansas at this time were necessarily that much worse than their white school counterparts, although this was certainly true in other parts of the United States. And that's one of the things that made the Brown versus the Board of Education case so important. It wasn't about demonstrating that specific schools were specifically worse than others. It was about proving that the actual concept of segregated education was inherently racist and made black pupils feel inferior. And that's what they were able to do. I should point out that in this lesson there will be uses of language which is both dated, racist and offensive, including one use of the N-word. I would remind you that this is powerful language. It's used within its historical context, and its use within these lessons in no way trivializes the power of these words. Firstly though, some key words and terms. Cloak's compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today comprises of the US Constitution. This is a list of the most important rights and laws that apply to all states within the United States of America. Secondly, the term unconstitutional, any law that breaks the rules of the Constitution. Thirdly, the Supreme Court. This is the highest court in the USA. It basically decides whether the Constitution has been broken or not. Lastly then, your task. Record the definition of each of these key words and terms. Then why might it be hard to change the Constitution? Give that some thought. Press pause now. Okay, hopefully you've got down what you need. Now, there have been times where the US Constitution has changed. One of the important and famous ones was the decision to reverse the Prohibition era, for example, when alcohol was banned in America. Then you've got other amendments to the Constitution. So the First Amendment being one of the most important, the right for all Americans to exercise free speech. Now, these are so fundamental to the makeup of American law and the American way of life that changing them usually represents a pretty important change to people's way of life as well. So a change to the Constitution takes a lot of consideration and a lot of time, and therefore it's not something that Americans take at all lightly. Let's consider the situation in education in the 1950s. Here's a bit of crucial context. Firstly, the Plessy versus Ferguson case. Now, although this course really starts in 1854, you can't understand the situation then without first considering the Plessy versus Ferguson case. In 1896, the highest court in the USA, the Supreme Court, ruled in the Plessy versus Ferguson case that segregation was legal and did not go against the US Constitution. Remember, this is the list of laws and rights we mentioned earlier. The effect of this was that segregation on the basis of race was legal as long as the treatment of black people was separate to white people but equal. However, the images on the right begin to give an idea as to what that really meant. Segregation laws tended to be very good on the separate bit in their own right, but very bad on the equal bit. In other words, segregated facilities were rarely equal. They were just separate. Add to that the idea that actually separation in and of itself is inherently unequal, and you can see just how unjust these laws were. Clearly, the Jim Crow laws kept people separate, but they did not treat people equally. Your task, Sam. What was the ruling in the Plessy versus Ferguson case of 1896? Secondly, what should separate but equal have meant about how black people were treated in America? And then, based upon your work from previous lessons if you've done that, or based upon your own knowledge, give examples of where black people were not being treated equally in society. While you complete those tasks, you can pause the video now. Well, firstly, we should have identified that the ruling in the Plessy versus Ferguson case is that segregation was not inherently unconstitutional as long as the segregation was separate but equal. That should have meant that there should have been exactly equal quality of provision and amount of provision for both black and white people in America. Although again, I reiterate this point about separation and segregation being inherently unequal. But then what about examples of where black people were not being treated equal in society? Well, you may have looked at the case of Emmett Till before. Emmett Till was murdered in 1955, which actually came after the Brown versus Board of Education case that we're going to be looking at today. His murderers, who later confessed to the crime, were acquitted of his murder on the basis of the fact that there was not enough evidence. Or rather, it's more that there was plenty of evidence, but the jury who actually decided in that case were all white. Black people were not allowed to serve on that jury. That's one crucial way in which they were not being treated equally. Also consider segregated facilities. For example, on the bus network, the amount of seating between black and white passengers could be adjusted depending on the number of white passengers, and black passengers typically had to get off the bus and then reboard it through a separate set of doors in order to ride the bus. Separate was anything but equal. So education in the South, did it break this idea of Plessy versus Ferguson separate but equal? I'll give you a clue. It did. But let's be able to justify how. In the 1950s, many black children in the South had to pass white schools that were nearer to their home in order to get to their nearest black school. That in itself was unequal. When the family of Linda Brown challenged this idea, they lost because the Supreme Court said that this was in line with Plessy's separate but equal ruling. 4 other families from elsewhere in the United States tried and similarly failed to convince them. Here's a key question then. You can write a brief answer to this one. Did the Supreme Court uphold the Constitution correctly? Pause the video now while you consider that. Well, one of the uncomfortable things about this is that from a certain point of view, they did uphold the Constitution correctly, because the Constitution at that time said that segregation could include separate but equal. That was the precedent set by the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case. However, a different interpretation of the Constitution, which should guarantee equal treatment under the law, challenged this. And it was on that point that groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People wanted to challenge the Constitution and asked the Supreme Court to reconsider. Let's have a look at some crucial ways in which education was run and how in fact it showed that often education was separate but not equal. Plessy ruled that facilities for black people should be separate but equal. Consider each of the following points and decide whether they were separate but equal or whether they were separate but not equal. You could create a brief table with those 2 headings. As an extension, you could explain how you came to your overall judgment. Were the schools in the South separate but equal or not? Firstly, some southern states spent money on improving black schools in line with white schools. Black pupils had to go to black schools even if a white school was closer. Black pupils were made to feel worse than whites because of where they went to school. Both black and white children were provided with schools. Many, but not all, black schools had lower quality resources than white schools. And sixthly, black people often couldn't afford to live in areas with the best schools. Pause the video, categorise those different facts, and then make your judgment. Was education in the South separate but equal or not? Pause the video now. This is probably feeling pretty obvious by now, but you should have decided that these schools were not in fact separate but equal. They were just separate and very deeply unequal. That said, there were examples of so-called equality that campaigners on the side of the Plessy ruling would point towards. Some southern states spent money on improving black schools in line with white schools was pointed to as an example of separate but equal treatment. However, black pupils having to go to black schools even where white schools were closer was not equal. Black pupils were often made to feel worse as well because of the school that they went to. That's definitely not equal either. Though both black and white children were provided with schools. Again, this was pointed to as an example of separate but equal treatment. Many, but not all, black schools had a lower quality of resources than white schools. Again, that's unequal. And lastly, black pupils couldn't always afford to live in areas with the best schools. That again shows inequality. So what was done about this? Well, in this main case, the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education Supreme Court case, the status of black schools in the South was challenged, and the argument was made that segregation was against the Constitution. In 1952, the NAACP took on all 5 of the school desegregation cases under the name of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. They knew that if they focused on the schools themselves, they would lose, as states were good at arguing that black pupils were being provided with an education the same as white children. Instead, they focused on the issue that black children were made to feel inferior to white children. Watch the linked video, which very well explains the issues at stake in this case. Then, explain what the NAACP's argument to the Supreme Court was, and then why the NAACP were the ideal organisation to take on the case. Consider the type of group that they were and what their expertise was. Pause the video now and watch the video in the link. Okay, have you watched the video and completed both questions? If so, we'll proceed. So the NAACP's main argument was that even where schools had equal provision for black pupils, they still made black pupils feel inferior. This was shown by the way that they did experiments to show that psychologically black pupils treated themselves as being inferior to white pupils because of how they had learnt in society. That's a really modern idea for the 1950s, showing that actually effects upon society on children are more pervasive than people otherwise would have thought. The NAACP were an ideal organisation for this because they were made up of lawyers and they were challenging a law. So rather than going to the states themselves or going for direct action of trying to integrate schools, they were trying to change it via the legal route, which would then enforce change through the law. And as a group of lawyers with legal expertise and access to the Supreme Court, they were the ideal group to do this. Here is the Supreme Court in 1954. In the centre we can see the Supreme Court Justice who was in charge of the entire court. His name was Earl Warren. He becomes incredibly significant later on. Notice though that they're all white men. There was not a single black justice on the court at that time, nor a single woman. That's changed now. However, at the time it was going to be down to these reasonably elderly white men to make a decision that would affect millions of Americans. Here's the Supreme Court today, just by way of comparison. Again, you'll notice that they are on average quite a lot older, but then you have to be a very experienced judge to get onto the Supreme Court. Here's the breakthrough then. In the Brown case, the NAACP won. The Supreme Court is made up of 9 judges. Once they are appointed, they can keep their job for life unless they quit or unless they are forced to step down. In December 1952, a pro-segregation judge died. He was replaced by Earl Warren, who was not pro-segregation, and he ended up leading the Supreme Court. On May 17, 1954, the NAACP won the case and the Supreme Court ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional. This means against the law or against the Constitution, because black pupils were made to feel inferior. A year later, the Supreme Court ruled that desegregation of all schools should be carried out with all deliberate speed. Sounds very positive, doesn't it? But think about that phrase, all deliberate speed. What does that actually mean? The trouble is that left a certain amount of interpretation as to how quickly schools would have to desegregate. Your tasks then. Summarise the Brown versus Board of Education case under the headings who, when, what happened, why, and the results. How important was Earl Warren's appointment? Explain your point of view. And as a challenge, why would this ruling be important for other civil rights issues too? As a hint, consider why the court judged that segregation was unconstitutional. Pause the video now while you complete those tasks. Alright, let's consider task 1. Who have we included? Well, we should have included the NAACP, the Supreme Court, and specifically Earl Warren as leader of the Supreme Court. In terms of when, we should have noted down that the case started in December of 1952, when that pro-segregation judge died, and it was completed on May 17th, 1954. So what happened? Well, the Supreme Court did indeed rule that segregated education was against the Constitution on the basis that it made black children feel inferior. Why? Well, really because the NAACP were able to demonstrate that fact to the Supreme Court. So the result was that all schools would now have to desegregate, and here's the crucial phrase again, with all deliberate speed. So how important was Earl Warren's appointment? Well, consider what you saw in the video as well. Earl Warren, as a person who was anti-segregation, was instrumental in convincing the other Supreme Court justices to rule in that way. So what importance would this ruling have for other civil rights issues? Well, consider the importance of this being a legal precedent. When the Plessy case was passed in 1896, all subsequent segregation decisions were based upon it, based upon this lie of separate but equal. Now it could be demonstrated that if education being segregated made black children feel inferior, then the same might be said for other walks of life too. What about being made to sit at the back of the bus? Might that make black people feel inferior too? If so, that too could also be unconstitutional. What about having to sit in certain seating within public diners? Might that make people feel inferior too? If so, would that too be unconstitutional? This really is the beginning of many different challenges towards the segregation laws that existed in America at this time. So let's consider what changed. At the top we can see Linda Brown with the High Court decision newspaper. Underneath we can see a cartoon that shows that actually change was not immediate. It might be a bit blurred on your video, so I'll read what the caption says. The school at the background is labelled James Crow Public School. Remember, that's a play on this term Jim Crow, meaning segregation. And the little girl is saying with her birthday cake, "I'm 8 and I was born on the day of the Supreme Court decision." Hang on, if she's 8, what year would this cartoon be? Well, it was passed in when? 1954? 1954 plus 8? That would be 1962, wouldn't it? So surely this cartoon is arguing that even in 1962, segregation in schools was still going strong. Well, let's consider why that might be. Many white people in the South reacted with fury to the Brown decision. The more northerly border states in the South began to desegregate, as was required. Black teachers often lost their jobs though when schools integrated or desegregated. They were the first to be fired. In the Deep South, such as Alabama and Georgia, state government opposed change and even threatened to close schools rather than desegregate them. Angry white people formed the White Citizens Councils. These are often referred to as the WCCs, which used extreme violence to preserve segregation. They're basically a terrorist organisation. Membership of the Ku Klux Klan increased. Remember, this was a terrorist organisation that lynched and murdered black people and made them feel terrified for their lives. Groups of white parents protested outside desegregated schools and intimidated black pupils, forcing them not to join. And also the Plessy case couldn't be used to stop desegregation anymore though, because the Supreme Court had set a new precedent that all the states would have to follow. Your tasks then. Summarise these effects in a mind map with the headings violence, non-cooperation and desegregation. Then, given these effects, do you think that black people were better off or worse off in the wake of the Brown decision? Pause the video now and complete those tasks. Okay, let's consider some of them then. The more northerly border states began desegregation. Well, what do we think? Well, that should have gone with desegregation because it's an example of it actually working. Black teachers often lost their jobs when schools integrated or desegregated. That probably best fits non-cooperation. In the Deep South, state government opposed change and even threatened to close schools. That also is non-cooperation. The formation of the White Citizens Councils is an example of violence, as is membership of the Ku Klux Klan increasing. Groups of white parents protesting outside desegregated schools is probably a combination of non-cooperation and violence because they were showing intimidation to these black pupils. And finally, Plessy couldn't be used to stop segregation anymore, shows that things were desegregating. As for whether black people were better off or worse off, it's really a question of long term or short term. In the short term, yes, there was increased violence, but in the long term, this was the beginning of the end of desegregation, so that surely has to be seen as a positive. However, I'm going to leave it up to your interpretation. One of the common themes that we'll see with this course is that where there is progress, there is usually a white backlash to that progress. And the Brown versus the Board of Education case was no exception to that rule. We're going to look at 3 different sources now, and we're going to complete some tasks based upon them. Task number 1. Read the historian's interpretation and sum up the interpretation in your own words, so 1 to 3 sentences will be fine, and what does the interpretation suggest was the long-term importance of Brown, so not what happened immediately, but what happened further down, even months or years later. Make sure you're watching this in HD at the moment, otherwise the text may be unclear. A historian's interpretations. This is from the book From Jim Crow to Civil Rights by Michael Klarman. This was written in 2004. After both Brown rulings, the NAACP urged Southern blacks to petition school boards for immediate desegregation on threat of litigation. This means suing them if they didn't let them in. Blacks filed for such petitions in hundreds of Southern localities, including in the Deep South. In a few cities such as Baton Rouge and Montgomery, blacks even showed up in person to try and register their children at white schools. In the mid-1950s, but for the Brown decision, such challenges would have been inconceivable in the Deep South, where race relations had been least affected by broad forces for racial change. In other words, broad forces for desegregation. Okay, pause the video now and have a go at those tasks. Hopefully what we've recognised here is this is the beginning, long term, of black people feeling empowered to challenge segregation openly and publicly, so they could actually confront these racist institutions and try and register their children in these schools. However, to do so took a certain amount of bravery, to say the least, as the next source will probably reveal to us. You're now going to read source A. In what ways does this source misrepresent or lie about the relations between black people and white people in the South? As a hint, remember things like Emmett Till, the KKK and the White Citizens Councils. How did they behave? Source A is from a source called the Southern Manifesto, a declaration signed by 11 Southern states and made public in 1958. It rejected the Brown decision because the states did not accept that the segregation was unconstitutional. Bear in mind, this is very much the white racist view that's being put across. This unwarranted exercise of power by the court, contrary to the Constitution, is creating chaos and confusion in the states principally affected. It is destroying the amicable, that means friendly, relations between the white and Negro races, again that's a dated term for black people, that have been created through 90 years of patient effort by the good people of both races. It has planted hatred and suspicion where there has been heretofore friendship and understanding. Heretofore meaning up to now. Without regard to the consent of the governed, outside agitators are threatening immediate and revolutionary changes to our public school system. If done, this is certain to destroy the system of public education in some of the states. Okay, consider task 2 and pause the video now while you complete it. What I hope that you've recognised from this is that this is a very politely written note for the most part, but it is complete nonsense. The idea of there being friendly relations between black and white people can only be viewed from the point of view of the white people being perfectly happy with the circumstances as they are, without any regard to the racism that black people were suffering in the South. This idea of hatred and suspicion was very much alive, not friendship and understanding. Consider murders like Emmett Till and the thousands of other unpunished murders in the South, the intimidation and racism of the KKK and the White Citizens Councils. None of this suggests amicable relations whatsoever. Let's have a look at one final source. Read source B. What sorts of racist abuse are described? And secondly, why do you think Reverend Shuttlesworth was so determined to get his daughter into an integrated school? I do warn you that there will be some racist language in this source. Again, we need to look at this in the context of the period that we're studying and understand it in the context of it being a true reflection of the racism of the time. Source B. From the memories of Pat Shuttlesworth Massengill, daughter of the civil rights activist Reverend Shuttlesworth. Here Pat remembers when she and her sister Ricky were taken to the Phillips Academy in Birmingham, Alabama in 1958 to be integrated into a white school. The car pulled up and there were mobs of people saying "niggers go home" and shouting obscenities. All those vicious looking people saying things you hadn't heard before out loud. It didn't make sense to me to get out of the car with all those people surrounding us. But Daddy was going to try to do it anyway. They started to attack him. Then my mother got out because he was being attacked, and that's when she got stabbed in the hip. Pretty horrendous stuff, isn't it? Okay, pause the video now and complete task 3. Done? Okay, hopefully we've recognised that there is both physical and verbal abuse going on here. Not just the mention of obscenities and racist language, but also the intimidation of vicious people outside of the school, stopping them getting in. Also, there's the physical attack on the father and the stabbing of the mother in the hip. I'm reliably informed that she recovered from this stabbing and luckily she wasn't seriously injured. But nevertheless, doesn't this show what a violent backlash there could be against civil rights protests? And this was very much deliberate. Every time civil rights groups felt that they'd made some progress, certain white groups were very keen to show them that it was not worth, in their view at least, the risk and the danger that this would lead to. However, that shows the inherent bravery of the civil rights organisations. They knew that they were going to be facing these dangers, but that ultimately it would be worth it. And so the Brown versus Board of Education case is crucially important in that respect, but it is not the end of the story. It was going to be put to the test, and that test would come in 1957 at a school called Little Rock, Arkansas. That's going to be the subject of our next lesson, which I hope you'll be able to watch when you're ready. In the meantime, thanks very much for watching this video, and if you found it useful, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I'll say goodbye.